the last couple of months. I'm married to the love of my life, and I have a 11-month-old boy who's very notorious. And another fact about me is I don't I used to play piano when I was a very young person, but I started to drift towards percussion. I haven't actually learned percussion per se, but I play it on any random surface that you give me. I'm at Shriram Balaji everywhere: GitHub, X, Twitter, LinkedIn, Discord. You can find me as Shriram Balaji everywhere. Okay, that's enough about me. Right. Okay. So we know ChatGPT was launched on November 30, 2022, right? And now we have large language models starting to be integrated across a lot of products. This workshop is not a chat how to use a ChatGPT 101 course, of course, right? But what is this about, right? So chat, we know, is the most obvious choice for LLMs, because LLMs, since they've become part of, just LLMs are just an API call away, because of which it has become much more simpler for us to integrate them, right? And the most obvious choice being, we'll just slap a wrapper on top of them as a chat interface, and then call it a day, right? But so this is what we have in today's architecture, right? We have a user interface which calls an API, which has service A and B to X, and then they all call talk to database, simple, correct, right? And tomorrow it could be a possibility that we have LLMs integrated in our backend in some form or the another, right? And the hope with this talk is, can we make interactions with LLM simpler, right? As UI engineers, can we have some sort of a way to make it much more less intimidating for end users to not when interacting with LLMs, right? That's the whole premise of this talk. So this talk is slightly design heavy, but also we will also look at a couple of different sample applications of how you can implement them. I have a very small playground that I'll be talking about in the end, right? But we will mostly focus on certain UX patterns that can that can sort of show a different way, other an alternative, if you can say, to chat interface, right? So again, when the whole beginning of this thought process was me having a Twitter conversation with Amelia Wattenberger, who used to work at GitHub Next, which had GitHub Copilot. And so this sort of around a couple of months back, around May, is when I had this tweet with her. And after that, I started thinking about it much more deeply, and that is the whole point of what this talk has become, right? So let's just, at this point, I think I would assume that at least every one of you, or at least like 90% of you, have talked to ChatGPT or interacted with ChatGPT at some point or the other. So some of these terms might be already something that you're familiar with, but let's just get some jargon out of the way. When I say prompt, I mean it's just an instruction to an LLM, right? Every prompt you pass to LLM becomes part of a context. And what is context? Context refers to just the number of tokens that the model can immediately take as an input when generating responses, right? Again, all of this is massively oversimplified. There's a lot of things that go beyond what is the scope of what I want to talk over here, right? Because I want to mostly focus on the user experience part of it, rather than diving deep into the machine learning part of it, right? But just to put into perspective, right, let's say, like, if you take a given sentence that says, in this sentence, you see each token roughly translates to 4 characters, like that's the sentence, right? And the tokenizer used by GPT, but other LLMs have different implementations, right? But here you can see this sentence that I found has around 27 tokens and 132 characters, right? And it's the tokenization is not in a word by word manner. Every if I remember correctly, OpenAI uses tick token, which is their library for tokenizing, and different large language models have different implementations of a tokenizer, right? And this tokenizer is what I was referring to when this tokenization impacts the size of the token window, right? And the token window is actually a very important thing, right? Sorry, context window is actually important thing. I misspoke and said token window, but the context window here is the most important thing. Why? Because that is basically the all the information that LLM can inference from your input in order for it to respond back with a response, right? So the biggest problem I've seen when interacting with LLMs is there's missing context, right? Let's solve this case of the missing context. What is the case of the missing context? Is that LLMs have a way of generating a vast range of text based on user inputs, right? But it is versatile, but it can be very intimidating, right? It can also be very difficult for users to formulate effective prompts, and prompt engineering becomes a requirement, right? And because of which the context, like the users are more often they're not able to fit in that context, get the right set of responses from the LLM. Now, that's one challenge. There are a multitude of other challenges in the sense that, like for example, text inputs have no affordances. What does that mean is, when I say an affordance is basically a purpose or a thing that people can perceive when they use an experience, right? Like when you have like a blank text, or just a text input, right? More often than not, when I've seen people who are either non-technical or someone who has not used ChatGPT before, their expectations are varied when they are just interacting with text inputs, right? And the idea behind this talk is that let's not make it as intimidating, and let's just use some established patterns. We already have some established UX patterns that reduces ambiguity for an end user, right? Let's say one of those patterns is context menus, right? So context menus again have been around since, I don't know, like they've been around since the early 90s. And the whole purpose of context menus was to contextualize actions. I learned that it was popularized by Microsoft Word back in the 90s, but I do not know of that for sure, right? And but today, like, the context menus are quite literally a tool that we can use to provide context to LLMs, right? And so those, they can be used to replace a chat interface with actions relevant to the user, right? When I talk about all of these UX patterns that follow, some of them might be very obvious, right? Those might be like, yeah, of course, this is how we should be doing it. But the reason I have this talk is because I'm seeing more and more chat wrappers to large language models than think about this more holistically, from a user experience standpoint, right? And so that is where context menus can come in and say they can avoid the cognitive overload that users may have to face when interacting with AI, right? Let's just look an example of a context menu. This is Notion is already doing it today, right? So they have like a right click or a slash right click that has, shows up a context menu, and then has a bunch of actions that you can talk to the LLM with, right? That's one example, right? Those are context menus. What other UX patterns exist? Slash commands are also there. Like slash commands again have been popularized by Slack the last decade. They've become like an efficient way to perform like quick actions, right? Uh, Anyone who's used Slack is already aware of this fact that, you can talk to you can have like you can pre-configure a set of actions that can work instead of you instead of to put this more succinctly, right? Instead of you doing a bunch of different actions to put together, slash command can sort of automate that in a way that they can abstract that in a way, and then they can allow you to perform some quick actions, right? We can use slash commands for as a replacement for writing a descriptive prompt, right? And again, if you're on the latest GitHub Copilot, you can see this also, right? Like I have a Fibonacci here, code here, right? And this only works on smaller inputs, right? That's the bug that is there in the code, right? When I say slash fix, you can see on the right that GitHub Copilot has a slash fix command, and that allows it to give us that basically responds back with a memoized Fibonacci function that uses the memo object to store the results of previous computations, right? This works for larger when this reduces the time complexity to being linear and makes it basically work for larger values of n, right? That's the point. So if you leave the Fibonacci out of it, the UX here is that there are slash commands that Copilot has, right? And that has some shortcuts to writing instead of writing a descriptive prompt, right? Where slash commands shine is that they can be sort of a nice middle ground. Even if you have to have a chat interface, right, you can still have some slash command so that the user does not have to always give a very large prompt, right? Okay, so this is we are in a React conference, so we should most likely look at a playground that has React in it in some way, right? So this is I've built a fork of novel by Stephen Tay, who works at Vercel, and it's a notion like YSIG editor that comes out of the box with support for LLMs. Let's look at that very quickly. I'll just take you through a quick demo of that, and then we look at some pieces of what makes it how you can also build your own Google Docs like editor today, right? So let's go there. Yeah, so this is I've put it on Vercel here, right? And so the two things that we saw in our previous this thing were slash commands and right click context menus, right? So let's say I'm right clicking here, right? So let's write something first. So it's a right. Okay, so we can click on this and ask it to continue writing. Let's say, so this is again using Versal AI and GPT-4 to generate the text, right? So but you here you already see that the slash commands are integrated, right? But the context menu that I am much more so this is already there in a novel by Stephen Tay, right? My fork includes a specific use case that is not there, but I built it for the purpose of this talk entirely, right? So let's say I want to a most common action that you would have with when I've talked with LLMs is basically when I'm writing a Word doc or anything like that. I usually want to rephrase certain things, exaggerate or extrapolate a certain piece of information, or make a sentence concise, right? Like so let's say I want to let's take this for example, and this is the edit action that I've built, right? And so the edit action has a couple of things that you can either rephrase a sentence, you can either brief or elaborate, right? So some of these UX I have taken from Maggie Appleton's LLM sketchbook that I'm referring to later, but the core idea is that we can elaborate on a given piece of text, right? So when I'm elaborating on a core piece of text, it's basically able to. This is where I'm what I meant by having contextual actions, right? So I am so in a document writer, this is actually a key to have, and Notion is also doing something like this, right? So if I want to brief it up a little bit, I can make that text a little bit more briefer, things like that, right? So this is what enables us to have intelligent contextual actions instead of me. So imagine the alternate scenario would be me having a chat wrapper on the back, or a chat window on the right, and then basically going back and forth and copy pasting. Instead of that, we have baked in contextual interactions with the large language model. It doesn't even feel like it just feels like streamed response, right? It doesn't feel too intimidating to talk to the LLM right now. And that is what I want to sort of give an insight about as to how we can do something like this, right? I will take you briefly through some of the code, like just a couple of lines of code. I'll show. I won't go into details, a lot of details, but I'll try to keep it as concise as possible. Right. So this is where you can find the repository. This is a fork again, as I mentioned. It's a fork of novel, fork of this library by Stephen Tate. It's a fantastic library. It already has some of these actions, and I've just done some minor changes here and there for the purpose of this talk. Right. Okay. So let's just go back to the presentation quickly. This is sort of what the architecture of novel is today, right? It's basically it uses something called a step tap, which is like a YSIG editor, and it's wired to a completion API, which is written in Next.js. That is talking to Versal's AI SDK, which is sort of an abstraction or popular libraries like LangChain, OpenAI's SDK, and all of those things. It's an abstraction on top of that, and it allows you to stream responses much more easily, right? So that's what this is, right? And if I just show you the code for that, you can find it in the GitHub if you want. But as an app, it's a simple React Server Components app. We are not actually using anything about React Server Components, like other than like the basic layout, page, and route. So there's not a lot of complication that's going on over here. But this the index page here basically mounts the editor, right? And the layout for the app is also very simple. We are just having a bunch of providers, like the theme provider and all of that that goes in, right? But the core crux of this is basically in this core package that has the index file of that mounts the editor, mounts the tip tap editor. So as I showed before, right? So the tip tap editor is the YSEG editor that we are sort of wrapping over on top of, and then connecting to a completion API, right? So here you can see, like, I'm just going to ignore the rest of the things here. I'm just going to go straight into the core logic, right? So use editor is basically coming from tip tap. That is where we set up the tip tap editor to have any additional extensions. Tip tap has a lot of different extensions, right? And the menu that I showed earlier, if you remember, the menu that I showed earlier, right? This menu, this is an extension. This is part of an extension, custom extension that we have to create for TipTap, right? And TipTap allows you to customize this menu. Like you can create your own bubble menu. This is they call this a bubble menu, and TipTap allows you to create extensions on top of it, right? So we set up all of that here, and we use the use completion API, which is a hook from Versal AI, Versal's AI SDK, and like in our case, the completion API is /API/generate, right? And it is using the completion. It's basically a response back with the function that says complete, which you can pass in the actual prompt, right? So now let's go to the bubble menu that I talked about, right? And the bubble menu has a couple of different things. And here, this is the AI edit action selector that I have created, right? So this all of these is already there. You can change text, you can add a link, and anything that you expect a simple YC editor to do, right? And the edit action selector, it doesn't do a lot of things, right? As I showed you, it has like three options, which is a rephrase, brief, and elaborate, right? And what it is basically doing is, again, it's using the use completion API, calling /API/generate, and then has a bunch of callbacks based on whether the callback is successful on finish, and then if there's an error, there's an on error, right? So that is basically and the trigger. The important difference here is where we are providing the prompt to the LLM instead of the user doing it, right? Like, this is what a user would do, right? They would, anyone who is talking to a chat GPT would do something like this. They would say, rephrase the following sentence, type in the text, right? Or make the following text brief, and then the text. Similarly, elaborate in detail, and then the text, right? So this is basically what we are doing. We are basically plumbing the prompt in on behalf of the user, so they don't have to do it in like a large format, right? Again, this is just a very small thought process. This can be extended to much more complicated apps, for example, right? And let's just quickly look at this, the generate code. The generate is where most of the talking to OpenAI happens. So this is an API route. That's the convention for React Server Components to have. You can sort of, if you have not used React Server Components, like the app routers, not React Server Components specifically, the app router of Next.js 30, which uses React Server Components, it's basically you can have an API folder, and then if you say a route name /route.js or route.ts, that is the convention for having a function handler that you can that Vercel is right now hosting it in its own Lambda, right? So here you can see that this is the actual prompt that we passed to GPT for. Again, this is taken from the Stephen Tay's novel, right? I'm not making any changes to this core generate API. This is where they pass in the prompt. You can specify all of the options. Since Vercel AI SDK basically just is just a wrapper around OpenAI's SDK itself, you can pass in different options, right? But this I do not want to overwhelm with a lot of details as to how all of this is working, but this is sort of, you can think of this as very simply. We have a YSEG editor, there's a generate API, we talk to use the Vercel SDK, and then talk to OpenAI and get back the responses, essentially stream back the responses. So we have just looked at two patterns, which is context menus and slash commands, right? Are there more patterns that we can adopt, right? Like, there's just a couple of them that I want to go through, and then that's probably, there are obviously people who are much more better at UX can have a lot more ideas in this area, but these are just, I just want to leave you with like a couple of ideas so that you can think about it when you go back, when you have like an LLM to integrate. This can probably be of use there, right? So sliders and tiles also we've used in different contexts, right? This is GitHub Copilot for Docs. This is like a project that's been started by GitHub that allows you to like they have a documentation website. You can basically sec. So here you can see that this is just a video that I've embedded from the actual Copilot for Docs demo. Right here, they're actually you have a marked out documentation that you host in your GitHub repositories. You can sign up for GitHub Copilot for Docs, and then those marked out documents are indexed. And here, that basically search it sort of acts like a search engine for your documentation that is locally hosted. And since it's in your actual code base, it's always mostly up to date, right? Again, this is not mostly about the product itself, but rather the pattern, right? Like let's the important screen here is this, right? Like let's say I'm looking at your documentation site, and I already have experience with React. I'm already an intermediate developer. I already know this material well, and I want like a balanced response, right? So these are all things that you can change in as parameters that you can give to the model, and based on these, right, the response actually changes, right? So you can go in it, this can go into detail about like someone who's very new at this, they can modify the parameters or modify the sliders. They can basically dial things up and down based on the required level of difficulty. So you can sort of think of applying this pattern whenever you have to deal with let's I think it's a very popular series of explaining certain things to different age categories, right? Like explaining things to a 5-year-old versus explaining the same thing to a scientist or a PhD, right? So if you're building a product that requires an information retrieval mechanism where you have to explain things catered to different audiences, this could be a UX pattern, right? The another UX pattern is choosing your aesthetic, right? Like this is again coming from Maggie Apatow's excerpt from the LLM sketchbook, where for a given piece of text, right, you can have an AI that has different personalities, essentially, right? And again, this is sort of gamifying this a little bit, but the core crux is that you can create your own daemons that behave in specific ways for sort of helping you talk about or think about a certain piece of text, right? Like for this excerpt, right? Like I am typing an excerpt that says language models are not yet good enough for reliable to be reliable thinkers, right? If I have a devil's advocate daemon, it will basically play devil's advocate for me and then give me evidence backed solutions, right? Some already some so chat gpt probably does not do this today, but I know a couple of different ais like perplexity AI. They have references or links to documents. Bing also has references or links to documents whenever it is prefacing an information, right? So sort of the same idea, but it's just that every daemon has its own personality, right? And you can create your own daemon, you can have it do its own personalities, right? This can be useful in scenarios where as a thinking partner when you're building a tool that has that you want to when you're journaling, for example, or when you on all of those apps where you need a thinking partner. I think this sort of UX works, right? But the whole premise that I want to leave with this talk is we can use all of these context menus, slash commands, styles, daemons to make interaction with the AI much more seamless, right? And as UI engineers, I think it's our sort of forte to innovate and make these AI experiences feel less intimidating. And again, I've been repeating the whole concept of being less intimidating for users, because whenever I have interacted with anyone who has not used a chat interface for this sort of, their expectations are always misaligned, right? And at Microsoft also, we're sort of building co-pilots for different experiences, and I've taken some of the UX input from there as to if there is are there better ways of doing this, right? So here are some attributions, right? Like these, without the work of these people, this talk wouldn't have been possible. And that's all I want to leave with. Thank you.